Sarah Chen's heels clicked against the marble floor of her Pacific Heights home with the sharp precision of a metronome marking time until detonation. The house stood silent at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday that should have been ordinary. She'd cut her Seattle business trip short after closing the acquisition deal in record time, eager to surprise Marcus with the good news about the additional $50 million in funding their fintech startup had secured. The key turned in the lock with barely a whisper, her practice movements born from years of late-night returns from the office. The first thing she noticed was the unfamiliar perfume lingering in the air, something floral and expensive that definitely wasn't hers. Sarah's analytical mind cataloged the scent even as her heart began its descent toward her stomach. Jasmine and bergamot, Emma's signature fragrance from that boutique in Union Square they'd discovered together during one of their girls' weekends. Before we jump back and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Her designer handbag slipped from her shoulder as she moved through the foyer, past the living room where 2 wine glasses sat, abandoned on the coffee table next to the bottle of Chateau Margaux she'd been saving for their 5th wedding anniversary next month. The same wine she'd told Emma about just last week during their regular Tuesday lunch, when Emma had laughed and said Marcus was lucky to have someone who still planned romantic surprises. The kitchen came into view like a crime scene, revealing itself to a detective's trained eye. Marcus stood with his back to her, his usually pristine Oxford shirt wrinkled and hanging loose over his khakis. His dark hair, normally styled with mathematical precision for his investment banker image, was disheveled as if someone had been running their fingers through it. Emma faced him, her bohemian flowing skirt hiked up around her thighs, as she perched on the granite countertop where Sarah had eaten breakfast that morning before catching her flight. Emma's legs were wrapped around Marcus's waist, her paint-stained fingers the same fingers that had braided Sarah's hair during college finals week, that had held Sarah's hand during her father's funeral, that had been the first to congratulate her when she'd gotten engaged, now gripped the back of his neck with desperate intimacy. Their lips moved together with the hunger of people who believed they were safe from discovery. Time crystallized into something brittle and sharp. Sarah felt her professional composure, the same iron control that had gotten her through hostile takeovers and board meetings full of men who thought she was too young, too female, too foreign to belong, settle over her shoulders like armor. Her mind began calculating automatically, the timeline, the opportunities, the lies that must have been told. Well, she said, her voice cutting through their passion with surgical precision, this explains why you needed that extra $5,000 for work expenses last month. Marcus jumped backward as if electrocuted, his face cycling through expressions of shock, guilt, and something that might have been relief. Emma's complexion drained to match the white subway tiles behind her as she scrambled to pull her skirt down, her artistic confidence evaporating into the same terrified uncertainty Sarah remembered from their college days when Emma couldn't afford textbooks and was too proud to ask for help. Sarah. Marcus's voice cracked on her name like he was 16 again instead of 34. You're supposed to be in Seattle until tomorrow, clearly. Sarah set her handbag on the kitchen island with deliberate care, each movement precise and controlled. Though I'm beginning to think my travel schedule has been more convenient for you than I realized. Emma slid down from the counter, her bare feet hitting the floor with a soft slap that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Tears were already streaming down her cheeks, her mascara creating dark rivulets that reminded Sarah of the ink blots from the Rorschach test she'd taken during her college psychology elective. What do you see when everything familiar becomes unrecognizable? Sarah, please, let me explain. Emma's voice broke on the words. Explain what exactly? Sarah's tone remained conversational, almost pleasant. How long you've been fucking my husband? Whether it started before or after you held my hand while I cried about our marriage problems. Or maybe you'd like to explain why you've been asking such detailed questions about our divorce proceedings. The word divorce hung in the air like smoke from a fire everyone had been pretending not to smell. They'd been separated for 3 months, living in the same house but sleeping in different bedrooms, trying to work through their problems with Dr. Patterson, their couples therapist. Sarah had been optimistic about their last session, when Marcus had finally admitted to feeling emasculated by her success and promised to work on his resentment. She'd thought they were making progress. Marcus found his voice, though it came out smaller than his usual commanding baritone. It's not what you think, really? Sarah tilted her head with the same expression she used when reviewing quarterly reports that didn't add up. Because what I think is that my best friend has been sharing intimate details about my emotional state and legal strategy with my soon-to-be ex-husband while they planned their romantic future with money from our joint account. Am I warm? Emma's crying intensified, her whole body shaking with the force of her sobs. I never meant for this to happen. You have to believe me. It started so innocently. Marcus was hurting, and you were always working, and I thought I was just being a good friend to both of you. To both of us. Sarah repeated the words slowly, tasting their absurdity. How thoughtful. Though I'm curious, when exactly did comforting my husband transition into riding him on my kitchen counter? Marcus stepped forward, his hands raised, in a gesture that might have been surrender or supplication. Sarah, please don't do this. We can work through this like adults. Emma's right, it wasn't planned. After the separation, when we were both so confused and hurt, the single word carried enough ice to freeze San Francisco Bay. There is no we anymore, Marcus. There hasn't been since you decided to discuss our private conversations with Emma. Since you decided that instead of working on our marriage, you'd work on seducing the one person I trusted to help me navigate losing you. Sarah moved to the kitchen island and began removing items from her purse with methodical precision. Her phone, her car keys, her platinum American Express card. Each item clicked against the granite like pieces being positioned on a chessboard. How long? She asked without looking up. Sarah, Marcus started. I wasn't asking you. Her eyes found Emma's, and for a moment, Sarah saw the girl she'd roomed with freshman year at Stanford, the one who'd been afraid to eat in the dining hall alone, who'd needed Sarah to show her how to do laundry, who'd sworn they'd be sisters forever. How long, Emma? Emma wiped her nose with the back of her hand, a gesture so familiar it felt like a punch to Sarah's chest. 4 months. For months. Sarah's mind processed the timeline with the efficiency of the computer algorithms she designed. 4 months ago was when she'd confided in Emma about Marcus's growing distance, his criticism of her work hours, his subtle digs about her success making him feel inadequate. 4 months ago was when Emma had suggested Sarah be more understanding, more patient, had recommended giving Marcus space to find himself. 4 months, Sarah repeated. So you've been fucking my husband since before I told you about finding those charges on his credit card for dinners I never attended. Since before I asked you to help me plan a surprise weekend getaway to Napa to try to reconnect with him. Sarah, it's not like that. Emma's voice was barely a whisper. Then what is it like? Sarah's composure cracked just enough to let a sliver of the rage underneath show through. Please, enlighten me. What is it like to listen to your best friend pour her heart out about trying to save her marriage while you're planning to destroy it? What is it like to offer advice on how to be a better wife to a man you're already sleeping with? Marcus stepped between them, his investment banker instincts finally kicking in as he tried to regain control of a situation that had spiraled far beyond his management capabilities. That's enough. Yes, we made mistakes, but attacking Emma isn't going to solve anything. We're all adults here. Sarah's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. Adults? Yes. Let's talk about being adults, Marcus. Adults don't withdraw $50,000 from joint accounts to pay deposits on Love Nest and Soma. Adults don't lie to their wives about working late while they're actually auditioning their replacements. And adults certainly don't bring their affair partners into the marital home to fuck on surfaces where their wife prepares food. The color drained from Marcus's face. How did you know about the apartment? About the money? Sarah's smile was razor thin. I'm a tech executive. Marcus, I didn't build a company worth $200 million by being careless about financial oversight. I've been tracking every penny you've spent since we separated, including the credit card charges for Emma's art supplies and the subscription to that meditation app she's always recommending. Emma's sobs had quieted into hiccuping breaths, but her eyes had gone wide with a new understanding of exactly how much Sarah knew, how carefully she'd been watching, how thoroughly she'd been documenting their betrayal. The apartment deposit, Sarah continued conversationally, the furniture from West Elm, the couple's massage package at that spa in Sausalito, the joint Spotify account, the reservation at Gary Danko for tomorrow night, which I assume was meant to be a celebration of some kind. Am I missing anything? Marcus's mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water. His carefully constructed facade of the successful investment banker was crumbling, revealing the weak-willed man underneath who'd spent their entire marriage coasting on his wife's ambition and success. Tomorrow night was supposed to be when we told you, Emma whispered, about us, about moving in together. We wanted to do it properly, respectfully. Sarah tested the word like she might test a wine that had turned to vinegar. Of course, nothing says respect like fucking your best friend's husband in her bed while she's trying to save her marriage. We never used your bed, Marcus said quickly, as if this distinction mattered. Sarah stared at him for a long moment, seeing clearly for perhaps the first time. The man she'd married 5 years ago, not the charming, ambitious banker she'd fallen for, but someone who measured morality in technicalities, who justified betrayal with semantics, who took credit for other people's success while avoiding responsibility for his own failures. Get out, she said quietly. Sarah, we need to talk about this, Marcus started. Get out. Each word dropped like a stone into still water. Both of you. Now, Emma was already moving toward the door, grabbing her purse and sandals with shaking hands. Sarah, please, someday when you're ready. I hope we can know. Sarah's voice cut through Emma's plea with surgical precision. There is no someday. There is no forgiveness. There is no going back. You made your choice when you decided. My marriage was collateral damage in your personal growth journey. Marcus hesitated at the threshold, his face cycling through emotions like he was searching for the right expression to sell her on giving him another chance. Sarah, I know you're hurt, but this doesn't have to end everything between us. We can still be civilized about the divorce. We can still, Marcus. Sarah's voice was so calm it was almost hypnotic. If you say one more word to me right now, I will make it my personal mission to ensure that you spend the rest of your life understanding exactly what I'm capable of when someone underestimates me. Something in her tone, some quality that spoke of boardrooms and hostile takeovers and battles fought with weapons Marcus couldn't even identify, finally got through to him. He nodded once and followed Emma toward the door. Sarah stood in her kitchen, surrounded by the wreckage of her life, listening to the sound of their footsteps retreating across her marble floors. The front door closed with a soft click that seemed to echo through the suddenly cavernous house. For exactly 30 seconds, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of the betrayal, the crushing realization that the two people she'd trusted most in the world had systematically dismantled her life while wearing masks of concern and friendship. Her chest tightened with a pain so sharp it felt physical, like someone had reached inside her ribcage and squeezed. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, the pain transformed into something colder, more focused. Sarah walked to her phone and began scrolling through her contacts until she found the number for Diana Volkov, the most ruthless divorce attorney in San Francisco. The wine glasses on the coffee table caught the afternoon light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting small rainbows across the white walls. Sarah had always loved this house, had chosen every detail from the Italian marble to the custom millwork. She'd imagined growing old here, hosting dinner parties and watching children play in the garden. But as she waited for Diana to answer, Sarah found herself thinking not about what she'd lost, but about what she'd gained: clarity, purpose, and most importantly, the absolute certainty that Marcus and Emma had made a critical error in judgment. They'd assumed that because she'd been hurt, she would be weak. They'd confused her attempts to save her marriage with desperation. They'd mistaken her love for stupidity. Diana Volkov's office came the crisp voice of the attorney's assistant. "This is Sarah Chen," she said, her voice steady as granite. "I need to see Diana immediately, and tell her to clear her schedule. We're going to war." As she spoke, Sarah's reflection caught in the dark screen of her laptop, and for a split second, she saw not the wounded wife, but the woman who'd built an empire from code and determination. The woman who'd negotiated deals with men twice her age and 3 times her arrogance. The woman who'd learned that in business, as in life, the most dangerous opponent was the one who had nothing left to lose. Marcus and Emma had no idea what they'd just unleashed, but they were about to find out. The afternoon sun slanted lower through the windows, casting long shadows across the kitchen floor where, just an hour ago, her life had been completely different. Sarah poured herself a glass of the abandoned wine, noting absently that it had been allowed to breathe to the perfect temperature. Some things, she reflected, were worth the wait. As she spoke those final words into her phone, "We're going to war, Sarah felt something fundamental shift inside her chest, like tectonic plates settling into a new configuration that would reshape the landscape of her life forever. The afternoon light had deepened to amber by the time she ended the call with Diana's assistant, and the silence in her house no longer felt like abandonment but like the calm before a carefully orchestrated storm. Sarah moved through her home with the measured pace of a general surveying a battlefield. Each room told a story of deception she'd been too trusting to read. The guest bedroom where Marcus had been sleeping contained a suitcase she now realized had been packed for weeks, not days. The bathroom held 2 toothbrushes, his usual electric one, and a bamboo manual brush that screamed Emma's environmental consciousness. Even her own walk-in closet had been violated. She noticed gaps where Marcus had clearly been selecting which of his expensive suits and watches would make the transition to his new life. Her fingers traced the empty space where his Tag Heuer watch usually sat in its velvet-lined case, the watch she'd given him for their second anniversary when she'd still believed in their shared future. The absence felt symbolic somehow, as if he'd been systematically erasing himself from their marriage long before today's dramatic revelation. By 6 p.m., Sarah sat in Diana Volkov's corner office in the financial district, watching San Francisco's glittering skyline emerge as the last daylight faded behind the Bay Bridge. Diana's office was exactly what Sarah had expected from the city's most feared divorce attorney: floor-to-ceiling law books, framed photos with political figures, and a view that reminded clients they were paying for the best. Diana herself was a study in controlled power, a woman in her 50s with silver hair pulled into a chignon so precise it looked weaponized, and eyes that missed nothing. She'd built her reputation destroying men who thought they could outsmart women, and Sarah had chosen her specifically for that reason. "Tell me everything," Diana said, pouring tea from an elegant service that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. "And I mean everything. The timeline, the finances, the emotional manipulation. In my experience, men like your husband rarely limit their deception to one area of their lives." Sarah recounted the afternoon's discovery with the same clinical precision she'd used to present quarterly earnings to the board. She detailed the financial irregularities, the suspicious credit card charges, the pattern of lies that stretched back months. Diana took notes in what looked like shorthand, occasionally asking questions that revealed just how thoroughly she understood the psychology of infidelity. "The apartment," Diana said when Sarah mentioned the Soma building. "You said he used $50,000 from your joint account for the deposit?" $57,436, Sarah corrected, plus first and last month's rent. Altogether, it was just under $75,000. Diana's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's an expensive apartment, even for San Francisco. Do you know which building?" Sarah pulled out her phone and showed Diana the bank records she'd screenshotted. "The Meridian Tower on 3rd Street. I looked it up after I saw the charge. It's one of those luxury high-rises with concierge service and a rooftop pool. The kind of place Emma always said she'd live in when her art finally took off." "Interesting." Diana made another note. "I know that building. It was purchased about 18 months ago by an elderly investor named Harold Chen, no relation, I assume, who's been talking about selling. The real estate market in that area has been particularly volatile." Something about Diana's tone suggested this information was more significant than casual conversation. Sarah leaned forward slightly. "Why is that relevant?" "Because in my experience, the most effective revenge isn't just about winning the divorce proceedings. It's about ensuring that the consequences of betrayal extend far beyond the courtroom." Diana's smile was sharp enough to cut diamonds. "Your husband and his new girlfriend have chosen to build their love nest in a very expensive glass house. That creates certain opportunities." Sarah felt her pulse quicken as Diana's meaning became clear. "You're suggesting I look into purchasing the building?" "I'm suggesting you look into all of your options. You're a successful businesswoman with considerable liquid assets. Real estate investment is a perfectly legitimate use of your money, especially in a market as hot as San Francisco's. If that investment happened to give you certain insights into your ex-husband's living situation, well, that's simply good business sense." The idea hit Sarah like lightning, illuminating possibilities she hadn't even considered. She'd been thinking like a wounded wife instead of like the strategic mind that had built a tech empire from nothing. Marcus and Emma had chosen to flaunt their relationship in the most expensive way possible, using her money to fund their fantasy. But what if she could turn their dream into her chessboard? How quickly could something like that be arranged? Sarah asked. For the right client with the right resources? Faster than you might think. I have contacts in commercial real estate who specialize in discrete transactions. Of course, you'd want to structure any purchase through a shell company to maintain privacy. Sarah's mind was already racing through the logistics, the financing options, the delicious irony of becoming Marcus and Emma's landlord without their knowledge. What would I need to make this happen? Diana's smile grew wider. A very good lawyer, which you have. A willingness to play a long game, which I suspect comes naturally to you. And the understanding that revenge is a dish best served with proper legal documentation. They spent the next hour discussing strategy, both for the divorce proceedings and for what Diana delicately termed ancillary business opportunities. Sarah learned that California's community property laws would work in her favor, especially given Marcus's provable infidelity and financial misconduct. More importantly, she discovered that the Meridian Towers owner was indeed motivated to sell quickly due to health concerns. By 8 p.m., Sarah was back in her car, but instead of driving home to her empty house, she found herself heading south toward her mother's restaurant in Chinatown. Chen had built Golden Dragon from a single food truck into a chain of 5 high-end establishments, and Sarah had inherited more than just business acumen from her. She'd learned patience, strategic thinking, and the art of winning wars that other people didn't even realize were being fought. The restaurant was closed for the evening, but Sarah had keys. She found her mother in the kitchen, as she always did after hours, preparing stocks and sauces for the next day's service. At 72, Li Ming moved through her domain with the grace of someone who'd turned cooking into both art and weapon. Yeah, Sarah, her mother said without looking up from her cleaver work. You look like someone who's been eating bitter melon. What happened? Sarah had always marveled at her mother's ability to read emotions like other people read newspapers. She settled onto a stool at the prep counter and watched Li Ming's hands work their magic, transforming simple ingredients into something complex and satisfying. Marcus has been having an affair, Sarah said simply. With Emma. Li Ming's cleaver paused for exactly 1 beat before resuming its rhythm. The friend who always looked at your life like she was hungry and you were a banquet she couldn't afford. The observation was so precise it took Sarah's breath away. You knew? I knew she was the type who would take what didn't belong to her if she thought she could get away with it. And I knew your husband was weak enough to be taken. Li Ming began arranging vegetables with mathematical precision. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Sarah told her mother about the afternoon's confrontation, about Diana's suggestions, about the apartment building that represented both the ultimate insult and the perfect opportunity. Li Ming listened without comment, her face revealing nothing. In the old country, Li Ming said finally, we had a saying, when your enemy digs a grave, don't stop him. Just make sure it's deep enough for both of you to fit. That sounds like you're suggesting I should pursue this building purchase. I'm suggesting you should be very careful about the difference between justice and revenge. Justice restores balance. Revenge creates more chaos. Li Ming's eyes met Sarah's with the intensity of someone who'd survived revolution, immigration, and building a business in a country that didn't want her to succeed. But sometimes, little dragon, the only way to restore balance is to show people the true cost of their choices. They talked until nearly midnight, Li Ming sharing stories Sarah had never heard about the early days of the restaurant, about competitors who'd tried to sabotage her success, about the patient work of building something lasting, while others focused on quick victories. Her mother's wisdom wasn't about forgiveness or moving on, it was about understanding that power came from playing a longer game than your opponents could imagine. When Sarah finally drove home, her head was clear for the first time since the afternoon's revelation. She'd spent years trying to save a marriage to a man who'd never seen her as an equal partner, only as a provider. She'd wasted emotional energy on a friendship with someone who'd been nursing jealousy and resentment like a secret poison, but now, as she pulled into her driveway and looked up at the house she'd designed and paid for and loved, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months: excitement about the future. Marcus and Emma thought they'd won by choosing each other over her loyalty and friendship. They thought they'd outsmarted her by hiding their relationship while bleeding her financially and emotionally. They had no idea that they'd actually given her the greatest gift possible: clarity about who they really were, and the perfect motivation To show them who she really was in return, Sarah spent the rest of the night in her home office, researching Harold Chen's ownership of the Meridian Tower, studying the building's financial records, and drafting the framework for what would become Golden Gate Holdings. By sunrise, she had a plan that would make Marcus and Emma's new love nest into the most expensive mistake of their lives. The morning light streaming through her office windows felt like a benediction, blessing the birth of something new and potentially dangerous. Sarah Chen, the wounded wife, was dead. In her place stood someone far more formidable, a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to gain. The morning light streaming through her office windows felt like a benediction, blessing the birth of something new and potentially dangerous. Sarah Chen, the wounded wife, was dead. In her place stood someone far more formidable, a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to gain. By 7 a.m., Sarah was already dressed in her most intimidating power suit, the charcoal Armani that made venture capitalists nervous and board members compliant. She'd learned long ago that in business, armor came in many forms, and today she needed every advantage her appearance could provide. Her reflection in the hallway mirror showed no trace of yesterday's devastation. Instead, she saw the face that had negotiated $100 million deals without flinching. Diana's office was already bustling with activity when Sarah arrived at 8:30, despite the early hour. 3 assistants moved with choreographed efficiency while Diana herself stood at her conference table, surrounded by documents that looked suspiciously like they'd been prepared overnight. "I took the liberty of having my team research your opportunity," Diana said without preamble, gesturing to the papers spread across the polished mahogany surface. Harold Chen is 84 years old, recently diagnosed with early-stage dementia, and his adult children are pressuring him to liquidate his real estate holdings before his condition deteriorates further. Sarah approached the table, her heels clicking against the hardwood with military precision. The documents revealed everything: property assessments, maintenance records, tenant agreements, financial projections. Diana's efficiency was both impressive and slightly terrifying. "The building is valued at $12.8 million, Diana continued, "but Harold is motivated to sell quickly. My contact at Morrison Real Estate believes he'd accept $11.5 million for a cash offer with a 30-day close." $11.5 million. Sarah repeated the number, mentally calculating how the purchase would affect her liquidity. The acquisition of her fintech company had left her with substantial cash reserves, but this would still represent a significant investment. What about financing options? You could secure a commercial mortgage, but that would require more extensive documentation and a longer timeline. Given your particular interest in expediting this transaction, I'd recommend an all-cash purchase through a newly formed LLC. Diana's smile was sharp enough to perform surgery. "I've already drafted the incorporation papers for Golden Gate Holdings. All you need to do is sign." Sarah studied the documents with the same attention she'd given to every major business decision of her career. The legal language was precise, creating layers of protection between her personal identity and the property purchase. Golden Gate Holdings would exist as a legitimate real estate investment company with Sarah as the sole beneficial owner, but that connection would be buried beneath enough corporate structure to withstand casual scrutiny. "There are 3 other interested parties," Diana noted, watching Sarah's face for any sign of hesitation. "A tech startup looking for office space, a hotel development group, and a private investor from New York. If you want this building, we need to move today." The ultimatum should have felt pressuring, but instead, Sarah experienced the familiar rush she got from high-stakes negotiations. This wasn't desperation. It was opportunity disguised as urgency. Marcus and Emma had chosen their love nest without considering who might be watching, who might be calculating, who might decide to turn their sanctuary into a prison. "Draft the offer," Sarah said, reaching for Diana's fountain pen. $11.8 million, all cash, 15-day close, and make sure the terms include immediate management rights upon closing. Diana's eyebrows rose slightly. "You're willing to pay above the other offers?" "I'm willing to pay for certainty," Sarah began, signing the incorporation documents with fluid strokes. "In my experience, bidding wars are for people who can't afford to lose. I prefer to make offers that end conversations." Within an hour, Golden Gate Holdings existed as a legal entity with substantial backing and aggressive intentions. Diana's real estate contact, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Morrison, who wore her ambition like expensive jewelry, arrived at 10 a.m. with a purchase agreement already prepared. Mr. Chen is reviewing offers this afternoon, Patricia explained, spreading the contract across Diana's conference table. But between you and me, your terms are exactly what his children have been hoping for. No financing contingencies, no inspection delays, and a price that lets them feel good about taking care of their father's legacy. Sarah reviewed the contract with the methodical attention that had made her legendary in Silicon Valley boardrooms. Every clause was an opportunity for leverage, every term a potential weapon in the psychological war she was preparing to wage. The property included not just the residential units but also commercial space on the ground floor, parking structures, and most importantly, comprehensive management rights that would give her unprecedented control over Marcus and Emma's daily lives. There's one modification I'd like to make, Sarah said, pointing to a clause about tenant relations. I want to add language requiring all lease renewals to be personally approved by the ownership entity. No automatic renewals, no matter how current the tenant is on payments. Patricia looked puzzled. That's unusual for a building this size. Most owners prefer to minimize their direct involvement in day-to-day management. I'm not most owners. Sarah's smile was pleasant enough to pass casual inspection but cold enough to freeze champagne. I believe in maintaining close relationships with my tenants. Diana caught Sarah's eye and nodded approvingly. The modification was subtle but significant. It would give Sarah the legal right to force Marcus and Emma to justify their continued residence on a regular basis, creating ongoing opportunities for psychological pressure. By noon, the offer was submitted. Harold Chen's response came faster than anyone expected. Acceptance within 2 hours, with a request to expedite closing to just 10 days instead of 15. His children, it seemed, were even more eager to liquidate their father's assets than anticipated. Congratulations, Patricia said, shaking Sarah's hand with the enthusiasm of someone who'd just earned a substantial commission. You're now the owner of one of Soma's most prestigious residential buildings. Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction that had nothing to do with real estate investment and everything to do with the chess game she was about to begin. Marcus and Emma were currently celebrating their new life together, completely unaware that their landlord was about to change in the most dramatic way possible. Diana walked her to the elevator, carrying a thick folder of documents that would need Sarah's attention over the next week. You realize this is just the beginning, she said as they waited for the car to arrive. Purchasing the building gives you proximity and legal leverage. But what you do with those advantages will determine whether this becomes justice or just expensive spite. I'm aware of the distinction. Sarah accepted the folder, already mentally organizing the tasks ahead. I also understand that sometimes the best way to teach people about consequences is to let them experience them directly. The elevator doors opened to reveal her reflection in the polished metal surface, a woman who looked perfectly composed and utterly in control. It was an accurate representation, Sarah realized. For the first time in months, she knew exactly what she was doing and why. Her phone buzzed with a text from Ray, her older brother. Mom told me about Marcus. Want to grab dinner and talk? The message reminded her that her actions would have implications beyond her personal satisfaction. Ray was a detective with the SFED, someone who understood both justice and the dangerous allure of taking it into your own hands. But that conversation could wait. Right now, Sarah had a building to prepare for her new role as the most attentive landlord in San Francisco. History, telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She spent the afternoon at Golden Gate Holdings' newly established office, a sleek space Diana had helped her secure in the financial district, meeting with Carmen Santos, the building manager she'd hired away from a competing property with an offer too generous to refuse. Carmen was exactly what Sarah needed: experienced, discreet, and cynical enough about human nature to understand that some tenants required special attention. I believe in maintaining very close relationships with our residents, Sarah explained, as they reviewed the tenant files. I want to know about every maintenance request, every complaint, every social gathering that might disturb other tenants. This building should feel like a family, where everyone looks out for everyone else. Carmen's knowing smile suggested she understood the subtext perfectly. Of course, Miss Chen. Some tenants do require more personalized service than others. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah reviewed every detail of Marcus and Emma's lease agreement, memorizing their payment schedule, their guest policies, their parking arrangements. She studied the building's layout like a general preparing for siege warfare, identifying choke points and pressure points that could be leveraged for maximum psychological effect. The unit they'd chosen was on the 15th floor, a corner apartment, with panoramic views of the Bay Bridge that rented for $8,000 a month. It was exactly the kind of place Emma had always dreamed of living, with floor-to-ceiling windows and the kind of kitchen that appeared in architectural magazines. Sarah could imagine Emma posting Instagram photos of their morning coffee routine, their romantic dinners with the city sparkling below them, their perfect love story unfolding against the backdrop of San Francisco's glittering skyline. What Emma couldn't imagine was that every single aspect of that fairy tale existence was now under the control of the woman they'd betrayed. Sarah would be the invisible hand that determined whether their hot water worked reliably, whether their neighbors were considerate, whether their packages were delivered promptly, whether their lease would be renewed when the time came. By 6 p.m., Sarah was standing on the sidewalk outside the Meridian Tower, looking up at the glass and steel structure that had just become her most expensive weapon. In exactly 7 days, she would own this building and everything in it. Marcus and Emma would wake up in their love nest, completely unaware that their landlord was someone who had very specific ideas about what kind of tenants deserved to live comfortably. Her phone buzzed with another message, this time from an unknown number. Sarah, it's Emma. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I need you to know how sorry I am. Maybe someday we can talk and I can explain how everything happened. I never wanted to hurt you. Sarah stared at the message for a long moment, feeling something cold and sharp crystallize in her chest. Emma still didn't understand. She thought this was about hurt feelings and broken trust, about friendships that could be mended with enough time and apologies. She had no idea that this was about consequences, about the systematic dismantling of a fantasy built on other people's pain. Emma would learn, though. They both would. Sarah deleted the message without responding and walked toward her car, her reflection caught in the building's mirrored entrance. In 7 days, she would hold the keys to Marcus and Emma's perfect new life. She could hardly wait to see what she'd do with them. She could hardly wait to see what she'd do with them. The thought echoed in Sarah's mind as she stood in the marble lobby of the Meridian Tower exactly 1 week later, watching Carmen Santos conduct her first official walkthrough as the building's new management representative. The keys to Marcus and Emma's perfect new life were literally hanging from Sarah's Hermes keychain, each one a small metal reminder of the power she now wielded over their daily existence. The closing had been executed with the surgical precision that characterized all of Sarah's business dealings. Harold Chen's children had been grateful for the quick sale and generous terms, never suspecting that their father's building was about to become the centerpiece of an elaborate psychological warfare campaign. The wire transfer of $11.8 million had been processed at exactly 9 a.m., making Golden Gate Holdings the official owner of 36 luxury apartments, 2 commercial spaces, and the most expensive revenge plot in San Francisco. Real estate history. The previous management company kept excellent records, Carmen reported, her voice echoing slightly in the soaring lobby with its floor-to-ceiling windows and contemporary art installations. Most tenants are on automatic payment systems, security deposits are properly maintained in escrow, and there haven't been any significant maintenance issues in the past 6 months. Sarah nodded, maintaining the facade of a serious real estate investor, while mentally cataloging every detail that would be relevant to her true agenda. What about tenant satisfaction surveys? Complaint logs? I want to understand how residents really feel about living here. Carmen's smile suggested she appreciated Sarah's attention to detail. I've reviewed all the feedback from the past year. Most residents love the building, though there have been a few noise complaints and some issues with package delivery. Nothing that can't be addressed with proper management. They rode the elevator to the 15th floor, where Sarah would get her first official look at the hallway that led to Marcus and Emma's corner apartment. Unit 1507 sat at the end of a carpeted corridor lined with identical doors, each one representing someone's private sanctuary. But for Sarah, only one door mattered. This is our largest bedroom unit, Carmen explained, consulting her tablet. As they stood outside 1507, the current tenants moved in 3 weeks ago. Marcus Rivera and Emma Rodriguez. They're paid through the end of next month, and their lease runs for another 11 months. Sarah stared at the brass numbers on the door, fighting the urge to press her ear against the wood and listen for signs of life inside. Instead, she maintained her professional demeanor while her mind calculated the possibilities that 11 months of landlord-tenant relationship would provide. Have they submitted any maintenance requests? Actually, yes. Carmen scrolled through her records. They complained about inconsistent water pressure in the master bathroom shower. The previous management scheduled a plumber for next week. Perfect. Sarah's first opportunity to demonstrate her commitment to tenant satisfaction. Cancel that appointment. I want to personally assess any maintenance issues in our premium units before authorizing repairs. Schedule a time for me to inspect the unit myself. Carmen's eyebrows rose slightly. You want to personally inspect a minor plumbing issue? I believe in hands-on management. Sarah's tone brooked no argument. When tenants are paying $8,000 a month, they deserve attention from ownership, not just maintenance. Staff. As they continued the tour, Sarah absorbed every detail of the building's operations with the intensity of someone planning a military campaign. She memorized the locations of security cameras, noted the proximity of other apartments to 1507, and identified potential pressure points in the building's systems that could be leveraged for strategic inconvenience. The rooftop amenity space was particularly relevant to her plans. Marcus and Emma had specifically mentioned the pool and outdoor kitchen in their lease application, citing the space as one of their primary reasons for choosing this building. Sarah stood at the railing, looking out over the city while Carmen explained the reservation system for private events. Residents can book the space for parties, but we limit it to 2 events per month per unit to ensure everyone gets fair access, Carmen noted. The previous management was pretty flexible about the rules though. That's going to change. Sarah's voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent years making decisions that affected hundreds of employees. From now on, all amenity reservations require written approval from management. I want to review every request personally to ensure they're appropriate for our community standards. Carmen nodded, making notes on her tablet. Sarah could see the woman was beginning to understand that Golden Gate Holdings operated with a level of oversight that bordered on surveillance. Good. Carmen would be her eyes and ears, the conduit through which Sarah could monitor and influence every aspect of Marcus and Emma's residential experience. They spent the afternoon reviewing lease agreements, building policies, and maintenance schedules. Sarah paid particular attention to the noise ordinances, guest policies, and pet regulations that could be selectively enforced to create pressure. She also studied the renewal clauses that would give her leverage when Marcus and Emma's lease approached expiration. By 4 p.m., Sarah was settled in the building's management office, a small but well-appointed space on the ground floor that would serve as her operational headquarters. Carmen had arranged for a comprehensive tenant file review, and Sarah found herself studying the personal details of Marcus and Emma's application with the focus of a forensic accountant. Their combined income was listed as $120,000 annually. Marcus's consulting work and Emma's art sales and yoga instruction. It was barely adequate for the apartment they'd chosen, requiring them to spend nearly 70% of their income on rent. They'd provided references from previous landlords, employment verification, and bank statements that showed Marcus had depleted most of his savings for the security deposit. The financial precariousness of their situation was almost perfect. They were stretched thin, living beyond their means to maintain the fantasy of their sophisticated urban romance. Any disruption to their income or unexpected expenses could destabilize their carefully constructed new life. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Sarah, I know you don't want to hear from me, but we need to discuss the division of assets. My lawyer says we should try to settle some things before the formal proceedings begin. Can we meet somewhere neutral to talk? The irony was delicious. Marcus wanted to discuss asset division while sitting in an apartment that Sarah now owned, completely unaware that his ex-wife was currently reviewing his financial statements and planning his residential future. She stared at the message for a long moment, considering her response. Instead of replying, Sarah called Carmen into the office. I want to schedule that maintenance inspection for Unit 1507. Tomorrow afternoon would be ideal. Carmen checked her calendar. I can arrange it for 2 p.m. Should I give the tenants advance notice? 24 hours is standard, isn't it? Sarah's smile was perfectly professional. Send them a formal notice that ownership will be conducting a comprehensive unit inspection to assess maintenance needs and ensure compliance with building standards. As Carmen prepared the inspection notice, Sarah allowed herself a moment of anticipation. Tomorrow, she would stand in Marcus and Emma's love nest, ostensibly checking their plumbing, but actually beginning the psychological campaign that would define the next 11 months of their lives. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a call from Ray. She considered letting it go to voicemail, but her brother's persistence was legendary. "Hey, little sister." Ray's voice carried the mix of affection and concern that had characterized their relationship since childhood. "Mom mentioned you might be going through some stuff with Marcus. Want to grab dinner and talk?" "I'm fine, Ray." Sarah kept her voice neutral while Carmen worked across the room. "Just busy with some new business ventures." "Business ventures? Right." Ray's detective instincts were clearly activated. "Mom also mentioned something about you asking detailed questions about tenant rights and landlord regulations. That's oddly specific research for someone who's just fine." Sarah silently cursed her mother's tendency to share information with her overprotective older brother. "I'm diversifying my investment portfolio. Real estate seems like a logical expansion." "And this sudden interest in real estate has nothing to do with your divorce proceedings or your ex-husband's living situation." Sometimes Ray's ability to read between the lines was more curse than blessing. "Ray, I appreciate your concern, but I really don't need Sarah." His voice carried the tone he used when interrogating suspects who thought they were smarter than he was. "Whatever you're planning, whatever elaborate scheme you've convinced yourself is justified, just remember that revenge has a way of consuming the person seeking it more than the people it targets." The accuracy of his observation was unsettling, but Sarah had committed too much financially and emotionally to reconsider her course now. "I'm not seeking revenge. I'm seeking justice. Justice looks different when you're the one dispensing it. Just be careful, okay? I've seen what happens when good people convince themselves that bad actions are justified by their pain." After ending the call, Sarah sat alone in the management office, surrounded by tenant files and building blueprints that represented her new arsenal. Ray's warning echoed in her mind, but it was overshadowed by the memory of finding Marcus and Emma in her kitchen, of discovering the systematic betrayal that had been hidden behind masks of concern and friendship. Tomorrow, she would begin teaching them about consequences. Tomorrow, the real education would start. Carmen returned with the inspection notice, a formal document that would be delivered to Unit 1507 within the hour. Sarah reviewed the language, noting how the official tone would create its own form of anxiety. Marcus and Emma would spend the evening wondering what their new landlord was looking for, what standards they might be failing to meet. "Make sure the notice is hand-delivered," Sarah instructed. "I want to ensure they receive it today." As Carmen left to handle the delivery, Sarah remained in the office, watching through the window as residents came and went from their building her building. Each person represented a life she could now influence, but only 2 of those lives mattered to her grand design. In less than 24 hours, she would come face to face with Marcus and Emma in their sanctuary, armed with the legal authority to inspect every corner of their new life together. The anticipation was almost overwhelming. Sarah Chen had always been good at playing the long game. Now she was about to discover just how much she enjoyed it. Sarah Chen had always been good at playing the long game. Now she was about to discover just how much she enjoyed it. The thought lingered in her mind as she stood outside Unit 1507 at exactly 2 p.m. the following afternoon, her finger poised over the doorbell like a pianist preparing to strike the opening chord of a complex symphony. The hallway was silent except for the distant hum of the building's ventilation system and the rapid beating of her own heart. Sarah had spent the morning preparing for this moment, selecting her outfit with the same strategic precision she'd once used for board presentations. The charcoal business suit projected authority while the understated jewelry suggested success without ostentation. She needed to appear as the competent building owner, not the betrayed ex-wife. The door opened before she could ring the bell, as if Emma had been watching through the peephole. Sarah's former best friend stood in the doorway, wearing paint-stained yoga pants and an oversized sweater that Sarah recognized as one of Marcus's old college shirts. The casual intimacy of the borrowed clothing was a small knife twist that Sarah absorbed without visible reaction. "Miss Chen," Emma said, her voice carefully neutral, despite the obvious recognition in her eyes. I'm Emma Rodriguez. Thank you for coming personally to address our maintenance concerns. The performance was admirable. Emma was pretending not to know her, maintaining the fiction that this was a routine landlord-tenant interaction. Sarah could see the calculation behind Emma's forced calm, the desperate hope that they could navigate this encounter without acknowledging the devastation that connected them. Miss Rodriguez, Sarah's tone was professionally cordial as she stepped into the apartment. I make it a priority to personally inspect any maintenance issues in our premium units. Where's Mr. Rivera? I'd like both tenants present for the inspection. Relationships. But the company could survive a few weeks of reduced attention. Her personal mission was operating on a much more urgent timeline. Kevin, I understand your concerns, but I'm dealing with some personal issues that require immediate attention. The business will be fine, will it? Kevin's tone sharpened. Because right now it looks like our CEO is having some kind of breakdown that she's trying to disguise as a business expansion. If you can't refocus on what we've built together, maybe we need to discuss other arrangements. The threat was clear. Kevin was prepared to consider buying out her shares if she continued to prioritize revenge over their professional obligations. The possibility of losing the company she'd built from nothing was sobering, but not sobering enough to derail her plans for Marcus and Emma. Give me 2 weeks, Sarah said finally. Let me resolve these personal matters, and then I'll be completely focused on the business again. After ending the call, Sarah sat in the management office staring out at the city she'd conquered professionally but that now felt like a battlefield where she was fighting for something more personal than money or success. Kevin's warning echoed Ray's earlier concerns about revenge consuming the person seeking it. But Sarah pushed those doubts aside. She had 11 months left on Marcus and Emma's lease. 11 months to teach them about consequences, about the price of betrayal, about what happened when someone underestimated Sarah. Chen. Carmen knocked on the office door, interrupting her thoughts. Miss Chen, I have the electrician scheduled for Unit 1507 tomorrow afternoon, and the plumber can come Friday morning. Should I send advance notices? 24 hours for each visit, Sarah confirmed. And make sure they understand these are comprehensive inspections, not quick repairs. As Carmen left to prepare the notices, Sarah allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. The psychological pressure was already building. Marcus and Emma would spend the next week dealing with a parade of service workers examining every corner of their sanctuary, each visit a reminder that their privacy and comfort existed only at Sarah's discretion. Her phone chimed with a text message from Emma. Please, can we talk? I know you're angry, but this feels like something more than building management. I just want to understand what's happening. Sarah stared at the message for a long moment, seeing the desperation beneath Emma's carefully neutral words. Her former best friend was beginning to realize that their encounter hadn't been coincidental, that their new landlord's intense scrutiny was personal rather than professional. Instead of responding, Sarah deleted the message and returned to her tenant files. Emma would understand eventually. They both would. The real education was just beginning. The real education was just beginning. Sarah's conviction echoed in her mind as she sat in her management office 3 weeks later, watching Carmen deliver yet another official notice to Unit 1507. This one concerned unauthorized modifications to the balcony furniture arrangement and potential fire code violations regarding stored personal items. Each notice was perfectly legitimate from a legal standpoint, meticulously crafted to withstand scrutiny while systematically eroding Marcus and Emma's sense of security in their own home. But something was shifting in the dynamics of her carefully orchestrated psychological campaign. Sarah could feel it in the way Carmen's reports had become more detailed, more concerned. The building manager had initially embraced Sarah's hands-on approach with professional enthusiasm, but 3 weeks of daily surveillance reports and manufactured violations had begun to wear on even her cynical sensibilities. Miss Chen, Carmen said as she returned from delivering the latest notice, I need to discuss something with you about Unit 1507. Sarah looked up from the stack of tenant files she'd been reviewing, each one a potential source of leverage if Marcus and Emma tried to organize any kind of resistance among their neighbors. What kind of something? Mr. Rivera called the main office this morning asking for contact information for the building's previous management company. He said he wanted to verify some discrepancies in his lease documentation. Carmen's expression was carefully neutral, but Sarah could read the concern beneath her professional demeanor. He also asked specifically about the ownership transfer timeline and whether any building policies had changed since Golden Gate Holdings took over. The news hit Sarah like ice water. Marcus was investigating, which meant he was starting to question the coincidences that had been piling up around their apartment. Her ex-husband might have been weak-willed and morally flexible, but he wasn't stupid. 3 weeks of escalating building management scrutiny would eventually trigger even his limited survival instincts. "What did you tell him?" Sarah asked, her voice maintaining its usual control despite the sudden acceleration of her pulse. "Nothing beyond the standard information that ownership changed hands 3 weeks ago and that all previous lease agreements remain in effect." But he seemed persistent, like he was fishing for something specific. Sarah nodded slowly, her mind already calculating contingencies. She'd known this moment would come eventually, but she'd hoped to have more time to establish her psychological dominance before Marcus began connecting dots. Did he mention anything else? Any specific concerns or questions? He asked about the inspection schedule for other units. Wanted to know if the level of scrutiny his apartment has received is standard for all tenants. Carmen paused, clearly weighing her words carefully. "Miss Chen, I've been in property management for 8 years, and I've never seen an ownership group take this level of personal interest in individual tenants. If Mr. Rivera starts comparing notes with other residents," the implication was clear. Sarah's vendetta was becoming visible to anyone who cared to look closely enough. Her systematic targeting of Unit 1507 would be obvious to any objective observer, and Marcus was apparently becoming objective enough to notice patterns. "Schedule a building-wide meeting," Sarah said after a moment of consideration. "Next week, we'll announce new community standards and inspection protocols for all units. That should provide context for the attention Unit 1507 has been receiving." Carmen looked relieved at this return to something resembling normal property management. "That's a good idea. Should I prepare an agenda for building-wide policy updates?" "Yes, but make sure the new policies specifically address issues we've already cited in Unit 1507. Noise ordinances, guest registration, balcony maintenance, storage regulations. If we're going to increase scrutiny building-wide, we might as well craft it to legitimize what we've already been doing." As Carmen left to prepare for the building meeting, Sarah felt the first stirrings of genuine anxiety about her revenge campaign. Marcus's investigation represented a threat to the carefully constructed narrative she'd built around Golden Gate Holdings. If he dug deep enough, if he hired the right investigator, if he connected enough dots, her entire psychological warfare operation could collapse into a legal nightmare. Her phone buzzed with a call from Ray, and Sarah's anxiety spiked higher. Her brother's timing was uncanny, as if his detective instincts could sense her growing vulnerability from across the city. "Sarah, we need to talk," Ray said without preamble. "In person, tonight?" "Ray, I'm in the middle of tonight," he repeated, with the authority of someone who'd spent 15 years getting confessions from people who thought they were smarter than the system. "Mom's restaurant after closing. And Sarah, bring whoever you've been working with on this real estate venture. I want to meet them." The call ended before Sarah could protest, leaving her staring at her phone with the dawning realization that her family's protective instincts were beginning to interfere with her plans. "He's in a conference call with a client," Emma replied, gesturing toward the closed home office door. "But I can show you the bathroom," Ishui reported. Sarah moved through the apartment with the measured pace of someone conducting a legitimate inspection, but her eyes were cataloging details that had nothing to do with maintenance. The space was exactly as expensive and beautiful as she'd expected, floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the Bay Bridge, an open-concept kitchen with professional-grade appliances, hardwood floors that gleamed in the afternoon, sunlight streaming through the massive windows. But more interesting than the apartment's luxury were the signs of the life Marcus and Emma were building together. Fresh flowers on the dining table, Emma's art supplies scattered across the living room, Marcus's expensive suits hanging in the open closet, 2 coffee cups sitting beside a shared laptop on the kitchen counter. The domestic intimacy was both painful and strategically useful. These were details Sarah could leverage, comforts she could systematically disrupt. "The water pressure issue is in the master bathroom," Emma said, leading Sarah down a hallway lined with Emma's artwork. "It's been inconsistent for the past week, and sometimes the water runs completely cold without warning." Sarah examined the shower with the thoroughness of someone who actually understood plumbing, though her real focus was on the personal items scattered around the bathroom. Marcus's expensive cologne sitting next to Emma's organic skincare products, 2 toothbrushes in a ceramic holder, intimate proof of their cohabitation that would be useful for the divorce proceedings. The issue appears to be with the pressure regulator, Sarah said, making notes on her tablet. It's a common problem in buildings this age. I'll need to have our plumber examine the entire water system for this unit, which may require multiple visits over the next few weeks. Emma's face tightened almost imperceptibly. Multiple visits? Is that really necessary for a pressure issue? I believe in thorough solutions rather than temporary fixes. Sarah's smile was perfectly professional. We want to ensure our tenants have the best possible experience. The home office door opened as they returned to the living room, and Marcus emerged with the distracted air of someone who'd been pretending to be on a conference call. He was wearing jeans and a polo shirt that emphasized how much weight he'd lost since their separation, and his hair was longer than Sarah had ever seen it during their marriage. The casual confidence he'd always worn like expensive cologne was notably absent. Mr. Rivera, Sarah said, extending her hand with the formality of a business transaction. I'm Sarah Chen, the new building owner. I was just explaining to Miss Rodriguez that we'll need comprehensive access to address your plumbing concerns. Marcus's handshake was brief and clammy, his eyes avoiding direct contact. Miss Chen, he managed, his voice carefully controlled. Thank you for your personal attention to our concerns. The awkwardness was palpable, but Sarah found herself enjoying the dynamic rather than feeling uncomfortable. Marcus and Emma were clearly struggling with how to navigate this encounter, caught between their desire to maintain privacy and their need to ensure their housing situation remained stable. I've also noticed some other items during my inspection that we'll need to address, Sarah continued, consulting her tablet. The hardwood floors show signs of water damage near the kitchen island, possibly from improper cleaning. And I see you've made unauthorized modifications to the lighting fixtures. Emma looked genuinely confused. We haven't modified anything. We've been extremely careful about not changing anything permanent. The pendant lights over the dining table aren't the original fixtures installed in this unit, Sarah replied smoothly. According to building records, those were replaced without proper approval from management. Marcus stepped forward, his investment banker instincts finally kicking in. Those lights were here when we moved in. We have photos from our move-in inspection if you need documentation. I'll review your move-in documentation, Sarah said, making another note. In the meantime, I'll need to verify the electrical work meets current building codes. That will require an electrician to inspect all the wiring in the unit. She could see the growing frustration in both their faces as they realized this wasn't going to be a simple plumbing visit. Sarah was systematically finding reasons to justify ongoing access to their apartment, creating a paper trail of legitimate concerns that would let her monitor their lives under the guise of property management. Is all this really necessary? Emma asked, her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. We're good tenants. We pay our rent on time. We're quiet. We don't cause problems. I'm sure you are, Sarah replied. But as the new owner, I have a responsibility to ensure this building meets the highest standards. I'm sure you understand the importance of maintaining property values. The implied threat was subtle but clear. Their continued residence depended on Sarah's satisfaction with their compliance. Marcus and Emma exchanged a look that conveyed an entire conversation about their financial vulnerability and lack of alternatives. Sarah spent another 20 minutes documenting various concerns throughout the apartment, each one providing justification for future inspections. The loose handle on a kitchen cabinet, the slightly uneven alignment of a bedroom door, the need to verify the smoke detector batteries. Every detail became ammunition for her campaign of psychological pressure. As she prepared to leave, Sarah turned back to address both tenants with the demeanor of a concerned property owner. I want to remind you both about the building's noise ordinances and guest policies. We've had some complaints from other residents about parties and overnight visitors. I trust that won't be an issue going forward. Emma's face flushed. We haven't had any parties. We've barely had any visitors at all. I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding, Sarah said pleasantly. But I wanted to make sure you're aware of the policies. We pride ourselves on maintaining a peaceful environment for all residents. The lie was perfect, creating anxiety about complaints that didn't exist while establishing Sarah's authority to monitor their social lives. Marcus and Emma would now second-guess every interaction with friends, every conversation in the hallway, every moment of normal domestic life. As Sarah left the apartment, she heard Emma's voice through the still opening door. What the hell was that about? She found problems with everything except the actual plumbing issue we called about. Marcus's response was muffled, but Sarah caught enough to understand he was equally disturbed by the interaction. Good. Confusion and anxiety were exactly the emotions she wanted to cultivate. Back in the management office, Sarah reviewed her notes with the satisfaction of someone who'd executed a flawless opening gambit. The inspection had provided multiple justifications for ongoing access while establishing her authority over their living situation. More importantly, it had demonstrated to Marcus and Emma that their new landlord was someone who paid very close attention to details. Her phone buzzed with a call from Kevin Park, her business partner at their fintech company. Sarah hesitated before answering, knowing that Kevin's call would likely involve concerns about her recent distraction from their business operations. "Sarah, we need to talk," Kevin said without preamble. "The Yamamoto deal is stalling because you missed the client dinner last week, and the engineering team is asking questions about the budget approvals you haven't reviewed." Sarah felt a stab of guilt as she realized how much mental energy she'd been devoting to her revenge campaign versus their actual business responsibilities. "I can review the budget approvals this evening, and we can reschedule with Yamamoto." This isn't just about rescheduling. Kevin's voice carried the concern of someone who'd built a company alongside her for 3 years. "You've been distracted for weeks. Your assistant says you're spending entire days on real estate research, and you haven't been returning investor calls promptly." The criticism stung because it was accurate. Sarah's obsession with monitoring and controlling Marcus and Emma's lives was beginning to affect her professional judgment, and Ray's request to meet her real estate partners suggested he'd already done enough investigation to know that Golden Gate Holdings wasn't a typical investment opportunity. Sarah spent the afternoon in a state of controlled paranoia, reviewing every decision she'd made over the past month and trying to identify potential vulnerabilities in her operation. The shell company was legally sound, the building purchase was completely legitimate, and her actions as a landlord had all been within the bounds of property law. But the pattern of targeting was becoming undeniable, and patterns were exactly what detective minds like Ray's were trained to recognize. At 6 p.m., she found herself sitting across from her brother in the empty dining room of their mother's restaurant, the familiar smells of ginger and star anise providing a deceptively comforting backdrop for what felt like an interrogation. Ray had arrived in full detective mode, notebook out, expression serious, the kind of focused attention he usually reserved for murder suspects. "Tell me about Golden Gate Holdings," he said without preamble. Sarah had prepared for this conversation, but Ray's directness still caught her off guard. "It's a real estate investment company I formed to diversify my portfolio." "I've explained this already." "No, you've given me the cover story," Ray corrected. "What I want to know is why a tech executive with no previous interest in property management suddenly decided to purchase the specific building where her cheating ex-husband lives with her former best friend." The accuracy of his summary was breathtaking and terrifying. Sarah felt her carefully constructed defenses beginning to crumble under the weight of Ray's professional skepticism. "How did you find out?" Ray's smile was grim. "Sarah, I'm a detective. More importantly, I'm your brother, and I've been watching you self-destruct for a month while pretending everything is fine. Did you really think I wouldn't investigate when you started asking Mom detailed questions about tenant rights and landlord regulations?" Sarah stared at her brother, seeing not just the concerned family member but the trained investigator who'd built his career on unraveling elaborate deceptions. "Ray, you don't understand what they did to me. The systematic betrayal, the financial manipulation, the way they use my trust, I understand perfectly," Ray interrupted. "And I also understand that what you're doing right now is going to destroy you more thoroughly than Marcus and Emma ever could." Before Sarah could respond, the restaurant's front door chimed, and her mother appeared carrying a tea service that suggested she'd been listening from the kitchen. Chen moved with the deliberate grace of someone who'd decided to participate in a conversation whether she'd been invited or not. "Your brother is right," Li Ming said, setting the tea service on their table with ceremonial precision. "You're becoming someone I don't recognize. Someone who uses power to hurt people instead of building something meaningful." The criticism from her mother hit harder than Ray's professional concerns. Li Ming had always been Sarah's role model for strategic thinking and business acumen, but more importantly, she'd been the moral compass that guided Sarah's understanding of honor and integrity. "They destroyed my marriage and my friendship," Sarah said, her voice carrying more emotion than she'd allowed herself to express in weeks. "They planned their betrayal while pretending to help me save my relationship. They took my money, my trust, my love, and turned it all into ammunition for their affair." "Yes," Li Ming agreed. "They behaved dishonorably. But what you're doing now, stalking them, harassing them, using your wealth to make their lives miserable, that's not justice. That's just cruelty dressed up in legal language." Ray leaned forward, his expression softening from interrogation mode to concerned brother. "Sarah, I've seen what revenge does to people. I've watched good people convince themselves that elaborate punishment schemes are justified by their pain, and I've seen how those schemes consume everything decent about them. So what am I supposed to do?" Sarah's composure finally cracked, years of controlled emotions spilling out in a rush of anger and hurt. "Just let them get away with it? Pretend their betrayal doesn't matter? Move on like some enlightened Buddhist, while they live happily ever after with my money?" "You're supposed to live your life," Li Ming said quietly. "You're supposed to build something beautiful from the ashes of what they destroyed. You're supposed to be better than them." The simple wisdom of her mother's words hung in the air like incense, filling the space between Sarah's justifications and the truth she'd been avoiding. For the first time in weeks, Sarah allowed herself to really see what she'd become: a woman who'd spent $12 million and countless hours orchestrating the systematic psychological torture of two people whose greatest crime was being weak and selfish. "But they're getting away with it," Sarah whispered. "No," Ray said firmly. "They're not. Marcus lost a wife who supported him financially and emotionally for 5 years. Emma lost a best friend who would have done anything for her. They're living in an expensive apartment they can barely afford, surrounded by the knowledge that their relationship was built on betrayal and deception. Trust me, Sarah, they're not getting away with anything." As if summoned by their conversation, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message. The number was unfamiliar, but the message made her blood run cold. "Miss Chen, this is James Mueller, Emma's ex-boyfriend. I think we should meet. I have information about your tenants that you might find interesting." Sarah stared at the message, her mind racing through the implications. James Mueller was the photographer Emma had dated before Marcus. The relationship that had ended shortly before Emma and Marcus's affair began. If he was reaching out now, it meant the ripple effects of her revenge campaign were spreading beyond her control. "What is it?" Ray asked, noticing her sudden pallor. Sarah showed him the message, watching her brother's expression shift from concern to something approaching alarm. Ray understood investigations, and he understood how quickly complex revenge schemes could spiral into criminal territory. "Sarah," he said carefully, "who is James Mueller, and how would he know you're Emma's landlord?" The question hung in the air like a sword above Sarah's head. She'd been so focused on maintaining secrecy from Marcus and Emma that she hadn't considered how her activities might appear to other observers. If Emma's ex-boyfriend had connected her identity to Golden Gate Holdings, then her cover was essentially blown. "I don't know," Sarah admitted, "but I think I'm about to find out just how visible this whole operation has become." Ray and Li Ming exchanged a look that conveyed an entire conversation about intervention strategies and damage control. Sarah felt the walls of her carefully constructed revenge fantasy beginning to collapse around her, and for the first time since discovering the affair, she wasn't sure she had the power to control what happened next. The psychological warfare she'd been waging was about to become a much more dangerous game, with stakes she was only beginning to understand. The psychological warfare she'd been waging was about to become a much more dangerous game, with stakes she was only beginning to understand. Sarah's realization crystallized into cold certainty as she sat in the Blue Bottle Coffee on Mission Street at 9 a.m. the next morning, waiting for James Mueller to arrive and wondering how many other people had connected the dots between her identity and her revenge campaign. She'd chosen the meeting location carefully, public enough to feel safe, but with enough ambient noise to mask their conversation from casual eavesdropping. Sarah had spent the sleepless night since Ray's intervention reviewing every decision that had led her to this moment, and the conclusion was unavoidable. Her operation had become visible to too many people who had no reason to protect her secrets. James appeared precisely on time, and Sarah recognized him immediately from Emma's social media posts during their 2-year relationship. He was taller than she'd expected, with the kind of casual confidence that came from success in creative industries. His photographer's eye swept the calf analytically before settling on Sarah with unmistakable recognition. "Miss Chen," he said, sliding into the seat across from her with the easy grace of someone accustomed to reading people through camera lenses. "Thank you for meeting with me. I wasn't sure you'd be willing to discuss our mutual acquaintances." Sarah studied him carefully, looking for signs of agenda or manipulation. "Mr. Mueller, your message suggested you have information about my tenants. I'm curious how you know I own their building." James's smile was rueful, tinged with something that might have been admiration. "Emma called me 2 weeks ago, completely panicked about her new landlord. She said Golden Gate Holdings was conducting excessive inspections and creating problems. That felt personally motivated. When she described the woman who owns the company, successful tech executive, impeccable professional appearance, eerily calm demeanor, I knew exactly who she was talking about." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Emma had not only figured out her identity but had been discussing it with her ex-boyfriend, which meant the information was spreading beyond Sarah's ability to control or contain it. "Emma knows," Sarah said, more statement than question. "She suspected after your first inspection. She confirmed it when she saw Golden Gate Holdings Incorporation documents. You used your real name as the beneficial owner." James leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious. "Sarah, Emma is terrified. She thinks you're going to try to evict them or make their lives so miserable they'll be forced to move." Sarah felt a complicated mixture of satisfaction and unease at hearing about Emma's fear. The psychological pressure was working exactly as intended, but the fact that Emma had been researching her corporate structure suggested a level of sophistication Sarah hadn't anticipated. "What exactly did Emma tell you about our history?" Sarah asked. James's expression darkened. "Everything. The affair, the betrayal, the way she and Marcus planned their relationship while you were trying to save your marriage. She told me because she needed someone to understand why she thought you might be targeting them specifically." "And what did you tell her?" "I told her she was probably right, and that she absolutely deserved whatever you were planning." James's voice carried an edge of bitter satisfaction that caught Sarah's attention. "Emma has a pattern, Sarah. She's not the innocent victim she's probably portraying herself as." This was unexpected. Sarah had assumed James was reaching out to defend Emma or warn her away, but his tone suggested something closer to alliance than opposition. "What kind of pattern?" James pulled out his phone and scrolled through photos before showing Sarah a series of images. Emma at gallery openings, art shows, social events, always photographed with successful, wealthy men who looked like they could afford to support an aspiring artist's lifestyle. Emma targets men who can provide financial security for her art career, James explained. She's brilliant at finding guys who are successful but emotionally vulnerable, then positioning herself as their creative muse and emotional support system. When she's extracted everything useful from the relationship, money, connections, stability, she finds a reason to leave. Sarah stared at the photos, seeing Emma's familiar smile and context that reframed everything she thought she understood about her former best friend. "You're saying she was using you for 2 years. She convinced me to pay for her art supplies, her studio space, her living expenses, all while telling me I was the only person who truly understood her artistic vision." James's laugh was bitter. "When Marcus appeared married, wealthy, emotionally neglected, I became yesterday's patron. She dumped me 3 days before she started her campaign to console your husband." The timeline hit Sarah like lightning. Emma hadn't stumbled into an affair with Marcus during a vulnerable moment. She'd systematically planned the transition from one financially beneficial relationship to another, using Sarah's marital problems as an opportunity to upgrade her situation. "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah asked. "Because Emma called me 2 weeks ago asking for money. She said her new relationship was going through a rough patch and she needed help with expenses. When I refused, she got angry and said I was jealous of her happiness with Marcus." James's smile was sharp. "I want you to know exactly what kind of person you're dealing with. Emma isn't a confused friend who made a mistake. She's a predator who targets successful people and destroys their relationships for personal gain." Sarah felt the ground shifting beneath her understanding of the past year. She'd constructed her entire revenge campaign around the narrative of betrayal by a weak best friend who'd been seduced by Marcus's charm. But if James was telling the truth, Emma had been the architect of the destruction, not its victim. Before Sarah could respond, her phone buzzed with a call from Carmen. She almost ignored it, but the timing felt urgent. Miss Chen, Carmen's voice was tight with anxiety. You need to get to the building immediately. There's a situation with Unit 1507. Sarah's blood ran cold. What kind of situation? Mr. Rivera and Miss Rodriguez are in my office with their lawyer. They're demanding a meeting with building ownership about what they're calling harassment and discriminatory treatment. They have documentation of every inspection, every notice, every interaction we've had with them. The confrontation Sarah had been dreading was happening now, while she was sitting in a coffee shop learning that her entire understanding of the betrayal might be fundamentally wrong. I'll be there in 20 minutes, Sarah said, ending the call and looking at James with new urgency. I have to go. Marcus and Emma are confronting building management about the inspections. James's expression became predatory. Perfect. This is exactly what Emma does when she feels cornered. She lawyers up and tries to turn herself into the victim. Want some advice from someone who's been through this with her? I'm listening. Don't let her control the narrative. Emma's greatest skill is making other people feel guilty for her choices. She'll cry. She'll talk about how confused and vulnerable she was. She'll make you feel like the villain for holding her accountable. James leaned closer, his voice becoming intense. But remember, she planned every step of what happened to you. The affair wasn't a mistake, it was a business decision. 25 minutes later, Sarah stood outside the management office of her own building, listening to Emma's voice through the door as she explained to someone, presumably their lawyer, about the unreasonable and invasive treatment they'd received from Golden Gate Holdings. Marcus's deeper voice provided counterpoint, listing dates and incidents with the precision of someone who'd been building a legal case. Sarah took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and opened the door to face the confrontation she'd been both dreading and anticipating for weeks. The room fell silent as she entered. Marcus sat in one of the chairs facing Carmen's desk, wearing a suit that looked expensive but slightly rumpled, as if he'd dressed for battle but hadn't quite pulled it off. Emma occupied the chair beside him, her artistic bohemian style replaced by conservative clothing that was clearly meant to project respectability and vulnerability. Between them sat a woman in her 50s with silver hair and an expensive briefcase. Their lawyer, who looked up at Sarah's entrance with the calculating expression of someone preparing for negotiation. Mr. Rivera, Miss Rodriguez, Sarah said, her voice carrying the calm authority that had served her through countless hostile business meetings. I understand you have concerns about your tenancy. Marcus stood slowly, his face cycling through emotions as he processed seeing Sarah in this context. You, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Jesus Christ, Sarah, it's really you. Emma remained seated, but Sarah could see her hands shaking as she gripped the arms of her chair. I knew it, Emma whispered. I knew this couldn't be coincidence. The lawyer looked between Sarah and her clients with growing understanding. Miss Chen, I presume? I'm Rebecca Walsh, representing Mr. Rivera and Miss Rodriguez. We need to discuss the pattern of harassment my clients have experienced since Golden Gate Holdings took ownership of this building. Sarah moved to Carmen's desk and began reviewing the stack of documents they'd apparently brought. Every inspection notice, every policy change, every interaction documented with obsessive detail. The paper trail of her psychological warfare campaign laid out in black and white, undeniably targeted and systematically escalating. These aren't harassment, Sarah said finally, looking up to meet Marcus's eyes directly. These are legitimate property management actions taken in response to actual building code concerns and lease compliance issues. Bullshit, Marcus said, his composure finally cracking. You bought this building specifically to torment us. You've been using your ownership to invade our privacy and make our lives miserable because you can't accept that our marriage was over. The accusation hung in the air, like smoke from a fire. Everyone could smell, but no one wanted to acknowledge. Sarah felt the familiar rage building in her chest, the same fury that had driven her to spend $12 million on revenge in the first place. Our marriage was over? Sarah's voice remained calm, but there was something dangerous beneath the surface. Our marriage was over because you were fucking my best friend while I was trying to save it. Our marriage was over because you spent our joint savings funding your affair while lying to my face about working late. Emma finally stood, tears streaming down her face. Sarah, please, you have to understand. I understand perfectly, Sarah interrupted, her gaze shifting to Emma with laser focus. I understand that you spent 2 years positioning yourself as my confidant while planning to steal my husband. I understand that you used every piece of private information I shared with you as ammunition to seduce him. I understand that you helped him drain our joint accounts to fund your romantic fantasy. It wasn't like that, Emma sobbed. It just happened. We were both hurt and confused. And stop. Sarah's voice cut through Emma's explanation like a blade. Just stop lying. I know about James. I know about your pattern of targeting financially successful men and extracting everything you can from them before moving on to your next victim. Emma's face went white, her careful victim narrative crumbling in real time. Marcus turned to stare at her with dawning realization, as if pieces of a puzzle were finally clicking into place. That's not I never, Emma stammered. You called James 2 weeks ago, asking for money because your relationship with Marcus was having problems. Sarah continued relentlessly. You told him I was being unreasonable about the divorce settlement and that you needed financial support to get through the rough patch. Marcus's face had gone ashen. Emma, is that true? Did you call James for money? The silence stretched between them like a chasm opening up to reveal depths none of them had suspected. Emma's tears had stopped, replaced by something calculating and desperate. Marcus, you don't understand the pressure, Emma began. The pressure of what? Marcus's voice was rising. The pressure of actually having to support yourself instead of finding another man to pay your bills? Sarah watched the implosion of Marcus and Emma's relationship with fascination and something that might have been pity. All her elaborate psychological warfare, all the careful manipulation and strategic pressure, was being undone by simple truth-telling, and the revelation of patterns neither of them had been willing to see. You planned all of this, Marcus said to Emma, his voice filled with dawning horror. You planned the affair, you planned leaving James, you planned taking Sarah's money. I was just another mark. Emma's mask finally slipped completely, revealing the calculating woman underneath. You were miserable with her, she said defensively. She was never home. She made you feel inadequate. She treated you like an employee instead of a husband. I gave you what you needed. You gave me what served your purposes, Marcus corrected. And now we're both paying the price for your scheme. Sarah stood in her building's management office, watching the complete destruction of the relationship she'd spent months trying to sabotage, and felt something unexpected: emptiness. The victory she'd imagined, the satisfaction of seeing them suffer, was hollow in the face of the reality that their betrayal had been even more calculated and cruel than she'd understood. The lawyer cleared her throat, trying to regain control of a situation that had spiraled far beyond legal territory into personal devastation. Perhaps we should discuss the terms under which my clients will be terminating their lease. Sarah looked at Marcus, really looked at him for the first time in months, and saw not the villain of her revenge fantasy but a weak man who'd been manipulated by someone far more calculating than either of them had realized. The anger that had sustained her psychological warfare campaign was transforming into something more complex and infinitely more painful. Yes, Sarah said quietly. Let's discuss terms. Yes, Sarah said quietly. Let's discuss terms. The words hung in the management office air like the last notes of a symphony that had crescendoed into chaos before resolving into something unexpectedly mournful. The confrontation she'd orchestrated for months had finally arrived, but not in the way she'd imagined during all those sleepless nights planning Marcus and Emma's systematic psychological destruction. Rebecca Walsh, the lawyer, opened her briefcase. With the efficient movements of someone trying to restore professional order to a situation that had veered into personal devastation. My clients are prepared to terminate their lease immediately if Golden Gate Holdings will waive the early termination penalties and return their security deposits without delay. Sarah found herself studying Marcus's face as the lawyer spoke. He looked older than she remembered, worn down by months of financial pressure and the dawning realization that his entire relationship with Emma had been built on manipulation rather than love. The weak man she'd married was still there, but underneath the familiar selfishness she could see something new. Genuine shame. Where will you go? Sarah asked, the question emerging before she could stop herself. Marcus looked up, surprised by what sounded almost like concern in her voice. I don't know. I spent most of my savings on this place. Emma said she had some money saved from her art sales, but he glanced at Emma, who was staring at her hands folded in her lap. I'm starting to think there are a lot of things Emma told me that weren't exactly true. Emma's head snapped up, her eyes blazing with the desperate fury of someone whose carefully constructed facade was crumbling. How dare you act like you're the victim here? You were married, Marcus. You made the choice to have an affair. I didn't force you to betray your wife. No, Marcus said slowly, but you certainly made it easy. You made it seem inevitable. Like Sarah and I were doomed anyway, and you were just helping me find happiness. His voice grew stronger as he spoke, as if finally articulating these thoughts was giving him clarity he'd been lacking for months. You played us both, didn't you? You played Sarah by pretending to help save our marriage while you were planning to destroy it. And you played me by making me think I was choosing love when I was really just choosing your next meal ticket. Sarah watched this exchange with fascination and growing unease. The revenge she'd planned had been predicated on Marcus and Emma being united in their betrayal of her, presenting a clear target for her calculated psychological warfare. But watching their relationship disintegrate in real time was more complicated than satisfying. The early termination fees are waived, Sarah said suddenly, cutting through their argument. You can be out by the end of the week. Everyone in the room turned to stare at her. Rebecca Walsh looked suspicious of the sudden capitulation, while Marcus appeared genuinely surprised by what seemed like mercy. Just like that? Rebecca asked. No conditions? No additional requirements? Sarah stood and moved to the window, looking out at the city where she'd built her fortune and then spent it on an elaborate revenge scheme that had turned out to be both more and less than she'd imagined. Just like that, Carmen spoke for the first time since Sarah had arrived. Miss Chen, are you sure? The lease terms clearly specify I'm sure. Sarah didn't turn around, but she could feel everyone's eyes on her back. Sometimes the cost of holding people accountable becomes higher than the satisfaction of seeing them pay. The silence stretched until Rebecca Walsh cleared her throat. We'll need the lease termination agreement in writing, along with arrangements for the security deposit, return and move-out procedures. Carmen will handle the paperwork, Sarah said, finally turning back to face the room. You can coordinate directly with her. Emma stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor with a sound like fingernails on glass. That's it? You spend months making our lives miserable. You buy our building just to torment us. And now you're letting us go because you feel guilty? Sarah met Emma's eyes directly for the first time since the confrontation began. I'm letting you go because I finally understand what you are. And what you are isn't worth the energy I've been spending on you. The words hit Emma like a physical blow. Her mouth opened and closed several times before she managed to speak. You don't know anything about me. You never did. You just assumed I would always be grateful for your friendship, always willing to live in your shadow while you got everything you wanted. I wanted us to be sisters, Sarah said simply. I wanted to share my success with someone I loved. I wanted to support your dreams and celebrate your achievements. Instead, you saw my love as weakness and my trust as stupidity. Emma's face contorted with years of suppressed resentment. Your love came with conditions. Your support came with judgment. You never saw me as an equal. I was always your pet project, your charity case, your way of feeling good about yourself. Sarah felt the familiar anger rising in her chest, but it was tempered now by something like understanding. You're right, she said, surprising everyone including herself. I did see you as someone who needed my help. I thought that was friendship. But maybe it was condescension. Maybe we were both trapped in roles that were never going to work. Marcus had been listening to this exchange with growing agitation. This is insane, he said, standing and addressing both women. You're talking about friendship and support systems like Emma didn't systematically plan to destroy our marriage for her own benefit. Like she didn't spend months lying to both of us while she executed her scheme to trade up from James to me. And what about you? Emma turned on Marcus with vicious precision. You think you're some innocent victim? You were eager enough to believe that your wife was neglecting you, eager enough to let me stroke your ego and tell you how underappreciated you were. You wanted to feel like the successful, desired man instead of the kept husband, and I gave you that fantasy. At least I'm not pretending it was love, Marcus shot back. At least I'm not trying to rewrite history to make myself the wrong party. Sarah watched them tear each other apart with something approaching clinical detachment. This was what She'd wanted to see them suffer, to watch their relationship implode, to prove that their betrayal would ultimately destroy them both. But the reality was messier and sadder than the clean justice she'd imagined. "Stop," she said, her voice cutting through their argument. "Both of you, just stop. This isn't helping anyone." They fell silent, both breathing hard from the emotional exertion of mutual destruction. Rebecca Walsh looked like she wished she'd never taken this case, while Carmen appeared to be taking notes for what would undoubtedly be the most interesting tenant file in building history. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Kevin. "Emergency board meeting called for this afternoon. Yamamoto deal is falling apart, and investors are asking questions about your absence. We need to talk." The message was a cold reminder that while she'd been orchestrating psychological warfare against her ex-husband and former best friend, her actual life, her company, her professional relationships, her future had been deteriorating. The cost of revenge was becoming visible in ways she'd been too obsessed to calculate. "I have to go," Sarah announced, gathering her purse and moving toward the door. "Carmen, please expedite the paperwork for Mr. Rivera and Miss Rodriguez. I want this resolved by tomorrow." "Sarah, wait," Marcus called as she reached the door. She turned back to see him standing with his hands slightly raised, as if approaching a dangerous animal. "I know I don't have the right to ask this, but are you okay? This whole thing, the building purchase, the surveillance, the psychological pressure campaigns, this isn't who you used to be." The question caught her completely off guard. After months of treating Marcus as the villain in her revenge fantasy, she wasn't prepared for him to express genuine concern for her well-being. "I'm fine," she said automatically. "No, you're not." Marcus's voice was gentle in a way she hadn't heard since the early days of their marriage. "The Sarah I married would never have spent millions of dollars just to make two people miserable. She would have been angry, she would have been hurt, but she wouldn't have become someone who derives satisfaction from other people's suffering." Sarah felt tears threatening for the first time since discovering the affair. The Sarah you married was naive enough to trust people who were lying to her face. "Maybe this version is an improvement. Maybe," Marcus said. "Or maybe this version is just scared and hurt and trying to feel powerful again. Maybe this version is making choices she's going to regret when the anger wears off." Before Sarah could respond, her phone rang with another call from Kevin. She glanced at the screen, then back at the room full of people whose lives had become entangled with her revenge campaign in ways none of them had anticipated. "I have to take this," she said, answering the phone as she walked toward the elevator. "Kevin, what's happening with Yamamoto?" "They're pulling out." Kevin's voice was tight with stress. "They said our CEO seems distracted and uncommitted to the partnership." "Sarah, I've been covering for you for weeks, but I can't hold this together much longer. If you don't refocus on the business immediately, we're going to lose everything we've built." As the elevator doors closed behind her, Sarah caught a glimpse of Marcus and Emma still standing in the management office, no longer a united front, but two separate people whose relationship was crumbling under the weight of revealed truths. The psychological warfare she'd waged had achieved exactly what she'd intended, but the victory felt hollow in the face of Kevin's crisis call and the realization that her revenge had cost her more than just money. Standing alone in the elevator of the building she'd purchased as a weapon, Sarah finally understood what Ray had been trying to tell her. Revenge was a poison that destroyed the person carrying it more thoroughly than it harmed its intended targets. The question now was whether she could stop drinking it before it killed everything she'd worked to build. Standing alone in the elevator of the building she'd purchased as a weapon, Sarah finally understood what Ray had been trying to tell her. Revenge was a poison that destroyed the person carrying it more thoroughly than it harmed its intended targets. The question now was whether she could stop drinking it before it killed everything she'd worked to build. The elevator descended with mechanical precision while her mind raced through the implications of Kevin's crisis call. Yamamoto Industries represented more than just a lucrative partnership. It was validation that their fintech platform could compete globally, that the years of 18-hour workdays and strategic sacrifices had positioned them for exponential growth. Losing that deal wouldn't just cost them money. It would signal to the entire Silicon Valley ecosystem that Sarah Chen was no longer someone who could be trusted to deliver results. By the time she reached the lobby, Sarah had made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. She pulled out her phone and dialed Diana Volkov's direct number, the same woman who'd helped orchestrate the building purchase that had become her most expensive mistake. Diana, it's Sarah. I need to sell the Meridian Tower building immediately. The silence on the other end of the line lasted exactly 3 seconds. Sarah, that's a $12 million asset you purchased less than 2 months ago. The market conditions haven't changed enough to justify. I don't care about market conditions. I need it sold this week. Sarah pushed through the building's glass doors into the afternoon sunlight, her heels clicking against the sidewalk with the same urgency that had once driven her through corporate negotiations. Whatever loss I take is acceptable. May I ask why the sudden change of strategy? Sarah paused at the street corner, watching the ordinary flow of San Francisco life continue around her, while her carefully constructed revenge fantasy crumbled into something she no longer recognized. Because I'm about to lose something more valuable than $12 million, and it's time to choose what actually matters. The emergency board meeting was held in the conference room where Sarah had once felt most comfortable, surrounded by the financial projections and growth charts that represented her company's trajectory toward industry dominance. Now the same space felt like a courtroom where she was both defendant and judge, facing investors whose confidence in her leadership had been eroded by weeks of distraction and poor decisions. Kevin sat across from her with the expression of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. Yamamoto's withdrawal leaves us short on the Q3 funding we need for the European expansion. More concerning, word is spreading that our CEO has been unreliable. 3 other potential partners have requested additional meetings to reassess our organizational stability. Sarah absorbed the information with the same analytical precision she'd once applied to every business challenge, but now the stakes felt personal in a way they never had before. This company wasn't just her professional achievement, it was proof that she could build something meaningful, something that improved people's lives through technology and innovation. The revenge campaign had put all of that at risk for the satisfaction of making Marcus and Emma uncomfortable in their expensive apartment. What do we need to do to restore confidence? She asked. You need to demonstrate that you're fully committed to this business again, said Patricia Reeves, one of their early investors and the most blunt person on the board. The tech community is small, Sarah. People notice when a CEO disappears for weeks at a time to handle real estate investments while major deals fall apart. The criticism stung because it was accurate. Sarah had allowed her obsession with psychological warfare to compromise everything she'd spent years building. The woman who'd once been legendary for her focus and strategic thinking had become someone who made decisions based on emotion rather than logic. I'm selling my real estate holdings, Sarah announced. As of today, my only priority is this company and our growth objectives. Kevin looked surprised but cautiously optimistic. What about your personal situation? The divorce proceedings? The property management responsibilities? The divorce will be handled by my attorney. The property management will be handled by someone else. Sarah's voice carried the decisive tone that had once made her famous in Silicon Valley for closing deals others couldn't navigate. I'm done playing games that don't serve our business objectives. The meeting lasted another hour, with Sarah methodically addressing each concern and outlining her plan to rebuild their corporate reputation. It felt good to engage her strategic mind on problems that had solutions, challenges that could be overcome through intelligence and persistence rather than elaborate emotional manipulation. But as she walked to her car afterward, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Sarah, this is Emma. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I'm leaving San Francisco tomorrow. There's something I need to tell you before I go. Can we meet one more time? Sarah stared at the message for a long moment, torn between her instinct to delete it and a curious desire to understand what Emma might want to say. After months of psychological warfare and bitter confrontations, what could possibly be left to discuss? Instead of responding immediately, Sarah drove to the small cafe near Golden Gate Park where she and Emma used to meet for their regular Tuesday lunches. It was the same place where Emma had listened to Sarah's marriage problems with apparent sympathy while secretly planning to exploit every piece of information for her own benefit. But it was also where they'd celebrated Sarah's business successes, where Emma had painted Sarah's portrait as a birthday surprise, where 2 young women had dreamed about their futures without knowing how thoroughly they would betray each other. Emma was already waiting when Sarah arrived, sitting at their usual table near the window with 2 cups of coffee and the nervous energy of someone preparing for a difficult conversation. She looked older than she had just yesterday, worn down by the stress of her imploding relationship and the prospect of starting over in a new city with limited resources. "Thank you for coming," Emma said as Sarah sat down. "I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure I would either." Sarah studied Emma's face, looking for signs of manipulation or calculation, but seeing mostly exhaustion and something that might have been genuine remorse. "You said you were leaving San Francisco tomorrow morning." "I'm going back to Portland, staying with my sister until I can figure out what comes next." Emma wrapped her hands around her coffee cup as if seeking warmth. "Marcus and we're done. Completely. After yesterday, after everything that came out about my history with James, about the way I approached our relationship, he can't even look at me." Sarah felt a complicated mixture of satisfaction and pity. This was exactly what she'd wanted: Marcus and Emma's relationship destroyed, their perfect love story revealed as a calculated deception. But watching Emma's obvious pain didn't provide the vindication she'd expected. "Why did you want to see me?" Sarah asked. Emma took a shaky breath before answering. "Because I need you to understand that everything James told you about me is true. I did target successful men. I did use relationships to support my art career. I did plan the affair with Marcus as a way to upgrade from James to someone with more financial resources." The admission was startling in its directness. Sarah had expected denials, justifications, attempts to reframe the narrative. Instead, Emma was confirming the worst interpretations of her behavior. "But," Emma continued, "what James didn't tell you, what he couldn't know, is that I genuinely loved you. Our friendship wasn't part of some elaborate scheme. You were the one person in my life who I never tried to manipulate or use." Sarah felt tears threatening again, but this time they were tears of confusion rather than anger. "Then why? Why destroy something that was real for something that was fake?" "Because I was scared," Emma said simply. "Scared that your success would eventually make you realize how small my life was. Scared that you'd outgrow me, find better friends, more sophisticated people who matched your level of achievement. I thought if I could be with Marcus, if I could be part of your world in a different way, I wouldn't lose you." The explanation was so profoundly misguided that Sarah felt her anger shifting into something closer to bewilderment. "So you decided to destroy my marriage to save our friendship?" "I decided to take something I thought you didn't really want anyway." Emma's voice was barely above a whisper. "You complained about Marcus constantly, his lack of ambition, his resentment of your success, the way he made you feel guilty for working late. I convinced myself I was doing you a favor by giving you a reason to leave him." Sarah stared at her former best friend, seeing for the first time the deeply insecure person who'd hidden behind artistic confidence and bohemian freedom. Emma's betrayal hadn't been calculated cruelty, it had been the desperate act of someone so afraid of abandonment that she'd destroyed the very relationship she was trying to preserve. "You could have just talked to me," Sarah said. "You could have told me you were scared, asked for reassurance, been honest about your feelings instead of destroying both our lives." "I know that now." Emma's tears were flowing freely. "But I was so used to manipulation being the only way to get what I needed from relationships that I couldn't imagine honesty as an option." They sat in silence for several minutes. Two women who'd once been closer than sisters, now separated by choices that couldn't be undone. Sarah felt the weight of the past months settling around them, the psychological warfare she'd waged, the building she'd purchased as a weapon, the elaborate revenge scheme that had consumed her life and threatened her business. "I forgive you," Sarah said finally, surprising herself with the words. Emma looked up sharply. "What?" "I forgive you. Not because what you did was acceptable. Not because I'm okay with how you destroyed my marriage and betrayed my trust. But because holding on to this anger is killing me, and I choose to let it go." Emma began crying harder, her shoulders shaking with the force of her sobs. "I don't deserve your forgiveness." "Forgiveness isn't about what you deserve," Sarah said, standing and placing money on the table for both coffees. "It's about what I deserve. And I deserve to be free from the poison of carrying this hatred." As Sarah walked toward the cafe door, Emma called out one final question. "Do you think we could ever be friends again? Someday, when enough time has passed?" Sarah paused with her hand on the door handle, considering the question seriously. "No," she said gently, "but I hope we can both become people who deserve better friendships than the one we had outside the cafe." Sarah stood in the afternoon sunlight and felt something she hadn't experienced in months: peace. The revenge campaign was over, not because she'd defeated her enemies, but because she'd finally chosen to stop being defined by their betrayal. Tomorrow, she would focus on rebuilding her business and her relationships with the people who actually mattered. Tonight, she would call Diana and finalize the building sale, officially ending the most expensive lesson in the futility of revenge that San Francisco real estate had ever witnessed. Tomorrow, she would focus on rebuilding her business and her relationships with the people who actually mattered. Tonight, she would call Diana and finalize the building sale, officially ending the most expensive lesson in the futility of revenge that San Francisco real estate had ever witnessed. But as Sarah drove through the city where she'd built her fortune and nearly lost her soul, she realized that endings were rarely as clean as beginnings, and healing was a more complex process than decision-making. 18 months later, Sarah stood in the lobby of a gleaming new building in the Mission District, but this time she wasn't there as a vengeful landlord. The brass nameplate beside the elevator read Second Chances Foundation in elegant script, and the space buzzed with the purposeful energy of people transforming pain into progress. This building, purchased with a portion of the proceeds from selling the Meridian Tower, housed Sarah's newest venture, a comprehensive support system for women rebuilding their lives after betrayal, divorce, or financial abuse. Miss Chen, called Carmen Santos, who now served as the foundation's operations director, the entrepreneur's presentation session is about to begin. Are you ready to meet today's applicants? Sarah smiled, adjusting the simple pearl necklace. She'd chosen to replace the aggressive power jewelry that had once been her armor. The woman who'd spent $12 million on an elaborate revenge scheme had evolved into someone who preferred investment and healing over expenditure on hatred. Always ready, Sarah replied, walking toward the conference room where 5 women waited to pitch their business ideas for foundation funding. This was her favorite part of the work, the moment when someone who'd been systematically undermined discovered that their dreams were not only valid but valuable enough to warrant serious investment. The first presenter was Maria Gonzalez, a software developer whose ex-husband had sabotaged her freelance career by canceling her contracts and spreading rumors about her reliability. Maria's app for connecting domestic violence survivors with legal resources represented exactly the kind of innovation Sarah's foundation was designed to support: technology solutions born from personal experience with systemic problems. The market research shows over 2 million women annually need these resources, Maria explained, her voice gaining confidence as she outlined her business plan. But existing platforms are fragmented, hard to navigate, and often compromised by inadequate privacy protections. Sarah took notes, not just on the business metrics but on Maria's transformation during the presentation. 6 months ago, Maria had arrived at the foundation barely able to articulate her idea, convinced by her ex-husband's psychological manipulation that she wasn't smart enough to succeed independently. Now she spoke with the authority of someone who'd reclaimed her professional identity. The foundation's model was simple but revolutionary: provide not just funding, but comprehensive support for women launching businesses after life-altering betrayals. Each entrepreneur received financial backing, business mentorship, legal assistance, and most importantly, validation that their experiences had given them unique insights worth monetizing. After the presentations concluded, Sarah walked to her office on the building's top floor, passing walls lined with success stories from previous foundation recipients. Dr. Jennifer Walsh had launched a therapy practice specializing in betrayal trauma. Lisa Park had created a financial planning service for newly divorced women. Rachel Morrison had built a consulting firm helping other women negotiate equitable divorce settlements. Each story represented a life transformed from victim to victor, pain converted into purpose. It was the kind of alchemy Sarah had failed to achieve through revenge, but had discovered through redirecting her resources toward reconstruction rather than destruction. Her assistant knocked on the open office door. "Miss Chen, your 3 o'clock appointment is here." Sarah looked up from the grant proposals she'd been reviewing to see her brother Ray standing in the doorway, his expression carrying the mixture of pride and protective concern that had characterized their relationship since childhood. "Detective Chen," she said with mock formality, gesturing to the chair across from her desk, "what brings you to my den of feminist empowerment?" Ray's laugh was genuine as he settled into the chair, his eyes scanning the office walls. "Decorated with photos from foundation events and thank you letters from successful entrepreneurs. Actually, I wanted to talk to you about something work-related. We've been tracking a case involving financial abuse, and the victim could benefit from your foundation's services. Sarah listened as Ray described a situation that was all too familiar: a successful woman whose husband had systematically isolated her from her career, controlled her finances, and convinced her that she was incapable of independence. The psychological pattern was identical to what Emma had experienced, what Marcus had attempted with Sarah, what thousands of women face daily in relationships that look successful from the outside. Send her our intake coordinator's information, Sarah said, making a note in her calendar. We have a support group starting next week specifically for women dealing with financial abuse recovery. Already done. Ray's smile was proud. You know, little sister, I have to admit I was wrong about your revenge phase. I thought it was going to destroy you permanently, but it seems like it was just the detour you needed to find your real purpose. Sarah considered this assessment carefully. The months she'd spent orchestrating psychological warfare had indeed been destructive, but they'd also been educational in ways she was still processing. I don't know if I'd call it a detour, more like an expensive education in why revenge doesn't work, and what actually does. What actually does work? Building something better than what was destroyed, Sarah said simply. Creating systems that prevent other people from experiencing what you experienced. Converting pain into purpose instead of just transferring it to someone else. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock from Carmen, who appeared in the doorway, looking simultaneously excited and nervous. Sarah, there's someone here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment, but she says it's important. Behind Carmen stood a woman Sarah didn't immediately recognize, mid-30s, professionally dressed, with the kind of controlled composure that spoke of recent crisis management. It took a moment for Sarah to realize she was looking at Isabella Chen, her teenage niece who was now somehow a grown woman with a business degree and the confident bearing of someone who'd learned to navigate complex situations. Aunt Sarah, Isabella said, stepping forward with the directness that had always characterized the Chen family approach to difficult conversations. I need to talk to you about Emma Rodriguez. The name hit Sarah like cold water, bringing back memories she'd spent 18 months learning to process without anger. What about Emma? Isabella glanced at Ray, who nodded encouragingly. She's applied for assistance from your foundation. She's living in Portland, working as a barista, and trying to launch an art therapy program for women recovering from abusive relationships. Her application is sitting in your intake coordinator's files. Sarah felt the ground shift beneath her carefully constructed new life. Emma, manipulative, calculating Emma who'd destroyed Sarah's marriage for her own benefit, was now seeking help from the very foundation Sarah had built to help women recover from betrayal. The irony was so complete it almost seemed scripted. Did you know when you applied? Sarah asked. The application came through normal channels, Carmen confirmed. Emma Rodriguez listed her previous address in San Francisco and her work with yoga therapy, but she didn't mention any personal connection to you. The application is actually quite strong. Her program design is innovative, and her understanding of trauma recovery is sophisticated. Ray leaned forward, his detective instincts engaged. Sarah, you don't have to make this decision today. You could recuse yourself, let the board handle it, maintain appropriate boundaries, but Sarah was already shaking her head. The woman who'd spent $12 million proving that revenge was hollow had evolved into someone who understood that healing required facing complexity rather than avoiding it. Schedule a meeting, she said finally. I want to review her application personally. Are you sure? Ray asked. After everything that happened, are you ready to potentially work with Emma professionally? Sarah thought about the question seriously. Was she ready to sit across a conference table from the woman who'd systematically destroyed her marriage while pretending to be her best friend? Was she prepared to evaluate Emma's worthiness for foundation support based on merit rather than history? I'm ready to find out, she said. 3 days later, Sarah sat in the foundation's main conference room, reviewing Emma's application materials one final time before their scheduled meeting. The woman described in these documents was someone Sarah barely recognized, a trauma-informed art therapist who'd spent the past year working with domestic violence survivors, developing innovative techniques for processing betrayal and rebuilding self-worth through creative expression. Emma's personal statement was particularly striking in its honesty. My own experience with manipulative relationship patterns taught me how trauma can drive people to hurt others as a way of managing their own pain. I spent years using intimate relationships to meet my financial and emotional needs without considering the damage I was causing to people who trusted me. My goal now is to help other women break similar cycles of harm before they destroy their most important relationships. When Emma entered the conference room, Sarah felt a shock of recognition followed immediately by surprise. This was clearly the same person, but 18 months had transformed her in ways that went beyond the simple passage of time. Emma's artistic bohemian style had been replaced by professional clothing that suggested substance over aesthetic. Her nervous energy had been replaced by the kind of calm confidence that came from serious therapeutic work. "Sarah," Emma said, taking the chair across from the conference table with careful formality, "thank you for agreeing to meet with me. Personally, I know this situation is complicated." "Complicated is one way to put it," Sarah replied, maintaining professional neutrality despite the emotional complexity of the moment. "Your application is impressive. Tell me about your work in Portland." For the next hour, Emma described her trauma recovery program with the passion and precision of someone who'd found genuine purpose in helping others. She'd partnered with local domestic violence shelters to provide art therapy services, develop curriculum for workshops on financial independence, and created support groups specifically for women who'd perpetrated emotional harm and wanted to make amends. "The truth is," Emma said toward the end of their meeting, "I probably never would have understood the damage I was causing if you hadn't forced me to confront the consequences of my choices. The building purchase, the psychological pressure, even the way you systematically documented my manipulation, it made me realize I needed professional help to understand why I was hurting people I claimed to love." Sarah studied Emma's face, looking for signs of the calculated charm that had once hidden her true intentions. Instead, she saw something that looked like genuine accountability and hard-earned wisdom. "You went to therapy," Sarah observed. 2 years of intensive work with a specialist in personality disorders. "I was diagnosed with traits of borderline personality disorder, specifically the pattern of using intimate relationships to regulate my self-worth and financial security." Emma's admission was matter-of-fact, without the dramatic flair that had once characterized her emotional revelations. "Learning to manage those patterns has been the hardest work I've ever done, but it's also been the most important." As the meeting concluded, Sarah realized she was facing a choice that would define not just Emma's future, but her own understanding of forgiveness, redemption, and the possibility of transformation. The foundation existed to help women rebuild their lives after betrayal, but what about women who'd been the ones doing the betraying? "I'll have a decision for you within a week," Sarah said, standing and shaking Emma's hand with the formal courtesy of a business transaction. After Emma left, Sarah sat alone in the conference room, staring out at the San Francisco skyline where she'd once plotted elaborate revenge and now contemplated the complexities of mercy. The woman who'd bought a building to torment her enemies was being asked to fund the redemption of someone who'd systematically destroyed her life. The decision, when it came, felt both inevitable and revolutionary. Sarah Chen had learned to build foundations strong enough to support second chances even for the people who'd made them necessary in the first place. 6 months later, Emma's art therapy program was featured in the Foundation's annual report as one of their most successful initiatives, helping dozens of women process trauma through creative expression. Sarah and Emma would never be friends again, but they'd become something more complex and valuable, proof that people could change, that betrayal didn't have to define anyone permanently, and that the most powerful revenge was often the decision to stop seeking it altogether. Standing in her office as another day of meaningful work came to an end, Sarah looked out at the city that had witnessed both her downfall and her rebirth. The woman who'd once measured success by the suffering of her enemies had discovered something infinitely more satisfying: the ability to convert pain into purpose, one foundation grant at a time. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.